If it's Tuesday, Democratic leaders stand by their man for now, while dodging reporters' questions about President Biden's fitness for office as House and Senate Democrats huddle behind closed doors for the first time since the president's dismal debate performance. Plus, former President Donald Trump returns to the campaign trail alongside Senator Marco Rubio, one of his top potential picks for vice president, as the deadline to select a running mate is fast approaching. And President Biden prepares to address America's NATO allies in the next hour. It's a high-stakes moment for the administration to rally support for and quell concerns about the president's fitness for office. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamisha Sendor in Washington, where for now, President Biden appears to have stemmed the number of public defections inside his party. But Democrats still remain deeply divided over whether or not President Biden should step aside. Today, Democrats in both the Senate and House met for the first time since the president's disastrous debate performance nearly 2 weeks ago. And moments ago, after Senate Democrats held their weekly lunch meeting, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer reiterated his public support for the president. But Schumer also repeatedly dodged questions from reporters.
Are you confident that President Biden has what it takes to win in November and serve the next 4 years?
As I've said before, I'm with Joe.
Based on differences of opinion in the Democratic Party about the president, his ability to serve 4 years, that there might be a challenge at the convention, and if there is there the ability to throw out the virtual nomination?
As I've said before, I'm with Joe.
Senator Murray, who just left, made a statement last night saying that she believes that Biden needs to do more to demonstrate that he's strong enough to defeat Donald Trump, articulate a vision, and must seriously consider the best way to preserve his legacy. Do you agree with her sentiment?
As I've said before, I'm with Joe.
But Senator Schumer, doesn't it leave Democrats in a difficult...
So far, no Senate Democrat is calling for President Biden to step aside, but some are publicly urging him to reconsider staying in the race, while voicing concerns about his ability to win and his potential drag on down-ballot candidates. That comes after House Democrats huddled behind closed doors earlier today in what lawmakers described as a frank conversation about the president. Most lawmakers avoided reporters after the meeting, but others made clear they are standing by President Biden.
Do you think Biden will win in November?
Absolutely.
Did you speak up in favor of President Biden in there?
I didn't speak.
What was there more people saying Biden should step down or more people saying he should step down?
We're riding with Biden. We're riding with Biden.
Was that the
Did anyone mention Harris?
We're riding with Biden.
Was there conversation about Vice President
We're
Kamala?
riding with Biden.
Was there conversation about Vice President Kamala Harris in there?
We're riding with Biden.
And notably, Congressman Jerry Nadler, who, according to multiple sources, told colleagues privately on Sunday that the president should step aside, had this message publicly today.
All I'll say is the president made very clear yesterday that he's running. And to me, that's dispositive. We have to support him.
Do you have concerns about Biden? Do you have concerns about him being on the top of the ticket?
Whether I have concerns or not, is beside the point. He's going to be our nominee, and we all have to support him.
This all comes a day after leaders in the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus both publicly backed the president. Still, one lawmaker told NBC News that the mood inside today's meeting was, quote, shaky, and that Democrats fear President Biden is declining. Two other lawmakers told reporters that the party is far from united about the path forward.
Are you all on the same page?
No. What do you mean you're not on the same page?
They're not even in the same book.
Well, I think a lot of people are looking for a consensus. There's no consensus right now. There are a lot of members who expressed concerns, gave voice to those concerns. There were members who expressed concerns about making a switch and what that would entail. Suffice it to say, a lot of people are having these discussions in private, even though there's just a few of us who have gone public with our concerns.
Meanwhile, President Biden is facing another major test of his fitness for office as he prepares to host the NATO summit here in Washington this week. He's set to deliver remarks about an hour from now, and on Thursday, Biden will hold a solo press conference taking questions from the press. I'm joined now by my NBC News colleagues, Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, and also with me is NBC News White House correspondent Aaron Gilchrist. He's outside the auditorium where the president will deliver remarks on the 75th anniversary of NATO in just about an hour. So thanks both of you for being here. Ryan, I have to start with you. While some Democrats have reinforced their support for President Biden, many seem less than enthusiastic about the president at the top of the ticket here. So what are you hearing behind the scenes here? What's the latest?
I mean, there's still just a ton of anxiety, Amish. I think that's the best way to describe it. If Democrats were all unified behind President Biden, I don't think they would hide that fact from us. And while there have certainly been far more Democrats today coming out and definitively getting behind the president, there is still a wide ocean of congressional Democrats that have yet to take that step. Many still saying that they have concerns. Many still saying that they want to hear more. Many still saying that they're expecting something more out of President Biden before they can confidently get behind him to be their party's nominee this fall. The problem is they're running out of time. Of course, there is a nominating contest that's coming up in just a few weeks, but the bigger problem for them is that the longer this goes, the longer President Biden twists in the wind, that opens up the door to Republican attacks, and it makes it much more difficult when they do finally come around to make the case that they're 100% behind him going forward. So, the Senate Democrats, for instance, had a closed-door meeting, a closed-door lunch this afternoon. They came out of that meeting. They had the opportunity, hundreds of reporters standing around where they all could have said, yes, we're all together on this. We're all behind President Biden. Most of them chose not to do that, say that they didn't have any comments, just that it was a good discussion, and they're waiting to see more. So at this point, there's still a lot of uncertainty here as to what the path forward is for Democrats.
Well, Ryan, as you laid out with all that uncertainty and lawmakers dodging reporters' questions, I wonder, does it appear that House Democrats are focused on unifying at this point?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that that's the path that they'd like to get on. That's the goal that they have. But what unification looks like amongst Democrats right now seems to be the open question. There are still many Democrats who are telling us privately they do not have confidence in President Biden to be their nominee, and they're unwilling to just roll over and accept him as the nominee just because the president seems unwilling to come to that conclusion. So there's going to be a lot of soul searching amongst these Democrats over the next couple of days to try and figure out what their next steps are. The problem is they may come to a point where if their end goal is for him to step down, that there needs to be some sort of public détente between congressional leaders and the White House and the president himself where they call on him to step down. And I mean in wide numbers with the big congressional leaders, not just a few House rank and file Democrats. They may not be willing to do that because if they take on that challenge and he refuses and stays at the nominee, that may be the death knell to the Biden campaign going forward.
Yeah, definitely a lot of things going on Capitol Hill, and definitely a close space to watch here. Thank you so much, Ryan Nobles, for your reporting. And Aaron, I want to come to you. What's the sense inside the White House about where things stand right now? And do aides really think that President Biden has sort of come through the worst part of this storm?
Well, Yamish, President Biden has made it clear that he is staying in the race and that there's no equivocation on that point. He's made that point both to congressional leaders. He spoke with governors, Democratic governors last week. We know this week, as you noted, he's spoken with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. We've been able to confirm that he will speak with Democratic mayors tonight. So the campaign, I think, would say that the president has been out there engaging with members of the party, but he's also been out there talking to members of the public, talking to voters, trying to reassure them that not only is he staying in the race, but that he is the man who can beat Donald Trump. That's what he's been saying as he's been out on the campaign trail. And so I think from our reporting, there's a sense that perhaps some of the bleeding has stopped around the president's debate performance almost 2 weeks ago now, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the wound has healed. And so we anticipate that the campaign will continue to both talk about the sort of the talking points that a campaign would be talking about at this point in terms of how they believe President Biden will be a better president than President Trump would be in a second term. And they'll also continue to put the president out there to make sure that he's in front of potential voters and that he's engaging with other political leaders as well to show that not only is he staying in the race, but he still has the stamina, the vigor, and the mental acuity to execute on the job of beating Donald Trump in November and then going on to continue to serve for another 4 years, Yamiche.
And Aaron, as you talk about political leaders, some of the political leaders are both people that are elected officials, but also donors that give a lot of money to the Democratic Party and allow his campaign to do things like buy ads and all the things that they want to do. So is the president sort of more concerned about losing the support of members of Congress or those big, deep-pocketed donors?
Well, the campaign has made the point that President Biden is more focused on voters than any of these people. The president himself, I think, said yesterday in his interview on MSNBC that he's not worried about the big dollar donors out there, that he's more focused on trying to assure the American people that he is the person who can win in November and that his policies are ones that will prove to be beneficial to people across the country. There was a point at which the campaign shared that donations to the Biden-Harris campaign were still robust. We know that in the days immediately after the debate, the campaign said they were able to raise more than $30 million, a good portion of that from grassroots donations, I think making the point that there are still people across the country who are supporting President Biden, and the president seemed to indicate that he wasn't too terribly concerned about the big dollar donors out there. But of course, you know, campaigns are run and need that money in order to operate. And so even with the tremendous war chest that we know the Biden campaign has, there is still going to be that need for the campaign to raise money to be able to continue on through November.
Yeah, certainly they're going to need to raise money to really sort of power their campaign. But I also want to ask you about some other high-stakes issues that President Biden is facing this week. There's the NATO summit, which, of course, is where you are, but there's also Thursday's press conference where he's going to take questions from members of the press, our colleagues. How is the president preparing for both of those big things?
Well, we know the president returned here to Washington Sunday night after some campaign events and has been in NATO prep mode, if you will, since that time. And when he meets first tonight, in the next less than an hour, we expect the president to be arriving here at the Mellon Auditorium, where the NATO organization was created 75 years ago. And he's going to speak about the importance of the organization, particularly as it relates to supporting Ukraine in its fight against Russia. We know that world leaders obviously will be gathered around the president, will be watching the president, just as so many here in the U.S. will be doing. And then when he meets with our colleagues on Thursday in that press conference, our understanding is that he's been getting prepped on some of the topics that will be coming up there. And obviously, Yamiche, we know that he will be asked questions about his health and whether he should continue on in the race for the presidency in November.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a consequential press conference, and we'll definitely be covering it. So thank you so much, Aaron. Now, while Democrats continue to debate President Biden's candidacy, former President Trump is returning to the campaign trail. Tonight, he's holding a rally in South Florida with at least one VP hopeful in tow. Former President Trump will be joined by Florida Senator Marco Rubio. And while we expect Trump to announce his VP pick before next week's Republican National Convention, Trump has hinted that he could wait to announce his choice at the convention. Last night, Trump told Fox News that he has held off on making his selection while Democrats sorted out their standing with President Biden.
We wanted to see what they're doing, to be honest, because, you know, it might make a difference. I don't know. I'm not sure that it would. But there are those that say Trump's waiting until he finds out what's going to happen with crooked Joe Biden. And we'll see what happens with Biden.
And joining me now on the ground in Florida ahead of Donald Trump's rally is my NBC News colleague, Dasha Burns. So, Dasha, I know it's hot out there. Thanks for being there with us. So Trump, though, he had this rally, of course, in Virginia right after the debate, and he's been posting online, but really he's been largely quiet, which is, of course, uncharacteristic for him in the aftermath of this debate. What should we expect for him tonight as he comes before this rally with Senator Marco Rubio in tow?
Yeah, Yamiche, it's been an odd time as a reporter covering former President Trump because it's very rare that he goes this long without owning a news cycle, but that's exactly what he and his campaign have done. They've sort of sat back and watched what's going on the other side of the aisle. And today, you're right, it is brutally hot out here, but crowds are gathering, and we see in the audience the front row is reserved for the former president's family members. We're going to likely see Eric Trump, Donald Trump Jr., his fiancée Kimberly Guilfoyle, some other Trump family members, also Marco Rubio and his wife, and 2 seats reserved for Marco Rubio as well. So quite an event here where, you know, they're all local and they are all going to be here today, Yamiche.
Yeah. Definitely a lot to watch there. I also want to ask you, I mean, as we talk about the VP stakes here, what's the latest thinking based on your sources and NBC News' sources when it comes to former President Trump's thinking when it comes to his VP pick?
Look, we've been reading the tea leaves for weeks now. Even this event today, the setup of the stage, the fact that many of Trump's family members will be here, the fact that Marco Rubio and his family are going to be here has ignited some serious speculation about whether it could happen tonight. What we know is it could happen anytime between now and the beginning or at the Republican National Convention next week. We know it's down to those three men we've talked about, Senator Marco Rubio, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Those are the three that have been talked about a lot among my sources. Of course, it's the former president. We have to caveat everything with he could pull a dark horse. He could make a move tonight. He could make a move at any moment here. He has said as recently as last night that he's thinking closer to the convention, potentially at the convention. But we're ready for it whenever it happens, Yamiche.
Yeah, we're certainly ready for it because, of course, we have you there in Florida, and we'll keep reading the tea leaves until then. Thanks so much, Dasha.
Thanks.
And coming up, holding the line, I'll talk to the top Democrat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee about President Biden's message to NATO and his political future. Plus, world leaders descend on Washington as Russia unleashes a deadly barrage on Ukraine, including striking a children's hospital in Kyiv. We'll dig into what this week's NATO summit means for the war. You're watching Meet the Press now.
I've seen the commitment by the Biden-Harris administration to go out and engage with Latino voters. And of course, we saw the president's recent executive actions to provide the protections to the non-citizen spouses of U.S. citizens. This is historic. And we have what's at stake is the other guy, which is going to try to undo all of the progress.
Welcome back. That was Congressional Hispanic Caucus Chair Nanette Berrigan standing by President Biden this morning on MSNBC. While some Democrats have publicly wavered, leaders in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus have loudly said they have President Biden's back. And joining me now is New York Democratic Congressman Gregory Meeks. He's the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Thank you so much for being here, Congressman.
Thank you for having me.
Now, today, on the way out of your caucus meeting, your colleague Steve Cohen said not only are Democrats not on the same page regarding President Biden, you're not even in the same book, he said. And another congressman also said there is no consensus inside the Democratic caucus. Is that what you've heard inside your meeting today? And how would you describe the mood inside the Democratic Party right now?
No, I actually thought it was a very good meeting because, this is the democratic process. And I think that Leader Jeffries is showing what a leader is all about, so that he could hear from all of the members of the Democratic caucus and the varied ideas, because I'm so glad that we are not the Republican Party who just marches in line with an individual who is a convicted felon, who has been also found guilty of assaulting a woman, who has taken away a woman's right to choose, who's never been someone that's for anybody else other than himself. And I think that's where the question really should be, as opposed to on the Democratic side, where we are having a dialogue and conversation. And I think that we're all agreed on one thing, that we cannot allow the existential threat to the United States of America and the world to become president of the United States again. And so we're working together. And what Leader Jeffries is doing by listening to all of this is, in fact, gathering all of the information and all the facts. I'm sure that he will relay to all parties involved, but ultimately the final decision is only one person's, and that is the President of the United States, Joe Biden. And he has said he's running, and I think if looking at the accomplishments that he made over the last 4 years and listening to him to talk about his agenda for the next 4 years, I have no problem. That candidate, that man, that commitment, those promises, to stand by him and re-elect him to be the President of the United States of America.
Yeah, and you just pointedly went after former President Donald Trump, so I want to ask you about him. Some of your colleagues are saying that President Biden should not run, and I'm wondering if you're concerned that the more this debate goes on among Democrats, your colleagues, about President Biden's age, that voters will not be thinking about Donald Trump, and they'll really be distracted by this conversation going on in the Democratic Party.
Well, I think that every Democrat will talk to you about Donald Trump. I think everybody knows who Donald Trump is. And I think no matter what happens on the Democratic side, we will all be together to make sure that Donald Trump is not the president of the United States.
But are you worried that the debate here is distracting voters from focusing on Donald Trump?
No, I think as long, the debate should be a debate that we should have, but it should be behind closed doors so that we can have honest conversation among ourselves and move forward, as opposed to not having the opportunity to talk. This is a democracy. It's not easy, it's messy. And so, you don't have a situation when you have a family and you don't talk to one another and be honest about what you feel. That's how you get situations resolved. That's what took place this morning. I think that is a healthy thing, not an unhealthy thing. And then I think that we have, based upon the record of the Biden-Harris team, the record of what the promises that Joe Biden made when he ran for president, the record of what has taken place in the United States House of Representatives under Republicans, and that will speak for itself, and we can all go out and articulate those facts because they are in fact facts. Unlike Donald Trump, who I think we should be talking about him taking a lie detector test, as opposed to people telling Joe Biden he has to take some tests. That guy we know is a liar, and that's not only known by Democrats. Just check out Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz in 2016. They are the ones that told the American people who he is. He's the same man now, except now he's a convicted felon.
Yeah, and I know you said that you think Democrats should be having this debate privately, but of course this is all public. A lot of this has been public, and I want to put up some of President Biden's letter he sent to congressional Democrats just yesterday, him writing this, and of course it became public. He said, "I wouldn't be running again if I did not absolutely believe I was the best person to beat Donald Trump in 2024. Do you agree with President Biden that he is ultimately the very best person that the Democrats have in this moment to beat Donald Trump in 2024?
I think that, why are we having this dialogue? So let's be truthful. We're having this dialogue because Joe Biden had a horrible debate. We wouldn't be here. We were talking completely different after the State of the Union. So Joe Biden had, and I think everyone admits, Joe Biden admits that it was a horrible debate. And so what happens now? Joe Biden will be out there. He's got NATO 75th anniversary taking place in Washington, D.C. right now. We will see his leadership again, as he's made a tremendous difference in bringing all of the Democratic governments together. We will see him at a press conference thereafter. We'll see him at a number of town hall meetings also taking place. And that way, everyone gets a chance to see him, to see his endurance, to see his ability to answer questions, and to show that that horrible debate was one night. But see, he's moving. I looked at the schedule. He's got a schedule that is full of things to happen, and people will see for themselves. In fact, that's what he says. He says, come watch me and show me. And looking at that schedule, it's a tough schedule. He's ready to do it, and we will fall in line.
Well, Congressman, is President Biden, though, the best person the Democrats have to beat Donald Trump in 2024?
The question is, right now, is Joe Biden, who has won the Democratic primary. Anybody could have been. He won the Democratic primary. He was selected and decided by members of the Democratic Party that he indeed was the individual who defeated Donald Trump before, and the right individual to defeat Donald Trump again.
But respectfully, Congressman, you're not answering the question. It's a yes or no answer here. Do you think that President Biden is?
We've got talent.
But is he the best person? Is the president the best person to beat Trump?
There's no one best person. We've got talent. So to tell me, to say, I'm going to say there's only one person and there's other people that I know are great talent that's in the bank, I'm not going to disparage any of the Democrats that we have here, because we are a very talented group. And what the media and others are trying to do is to try to say, oh, only one man, etc. And I think Joe Biden has said, given the circumstances of which we're in right now, that he is the best equipped, because he's been dealing with the situation for the last 4 years. So he's the best equipped, knowing all of that, to continue to move forward to complete the job. What we've had, for example, what happens oftentimes in these politics, what we see is that once Democrats get in charge, before finishing the job, it goes over to a Republican, and the economy and everything goes down to the tanks. He has had the plan that's gotten us this far, and he understands the plan to get us through the next 4 years.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you explaining your position here, Congressman, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And up next, we're digging deeper into what's next for Democrats and down-ballot candidates as the party presses forward with President Biden at the top of the ticket. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. President Biden's effort to stem Democratic defections appears to be working. And even Democrats like Congressman Lloyd Doggett and Adam Smith, who are calling for him to step down, are saying they will still support Biden if he stays in the race.
I'm going to support the nominee in my party. I'd certainly support President Biden, but I think we would be less endangered of a Trump presidency if we had a different candidate.
Do you think Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump?
Well, he can, sure. I don't think it's likely, and if he turns out to be the nominee, I'm all in. Let's go, because he's certainly better than any of the other choices that are out there. But it is an enormous risk to take, and I think he would have a hard time making the best case for the Democratic Party.
Well, do you think that the Democratic Party would have a better chance of beating Donald Trump with somebody else? Is there
1,000%.
That comes as other Democrats worry that publicly voicing concerns about the president could damage both him and the party overall come November. Joining me now is our panel, Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Democratic pollster Margie Omero, and former Florida Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo. He's also an NBC News contributor. So, Tia, I want to start with you, and I want to read something that Semaphore wrote about Democrats' predicament this week. It said, quote, "What Biden can do is be stubborn in a way that sets up a scenario of mutually assured destruction for Democrats. So as long as opponents of his nomination believe it's impossible to force him to step aside, any escalation of their criticism risks damaging him even further in November. And the worse his standing gets, the more his party is likely to suffer up and down the ballot." So most Democrats that I've been talking to, and I'm sure you've been talking to, they sort of feel like there's no way forward without President Biden as the nominee. Do you really feel like their hands are tied here?
I think that politically they're in a tough spot because Biden right now is not open to stepping aside. And so even those who feel like they have valid concerns, there's no way forward in addressing their concerns. And so that leaves them voicing their issues, but not having any remedy other than, everyone saying getting on board. And that's leaving a lot of members feeling that their concerns aren't being taken seriously, but there's just no outlet. There's really no way to meet in the middle if Biden is where he is. And I think that's why you keep hearing Democrats saying they want to build a consensus and find a way to move forward, but there's no change in position and the concerns aren't necessarily going away.
Yeah. And Carlos, there's this interesting dynamic playing out. Of course, you served in Congress where you have lawmakers who multiple sources tell us they say one thing privately and another thing publicly. What's the calculation there for lawmakers?
Yeah, Misha, I've been thinking a lot about that because for Republicans, pretty much since Donald Trump became the nominee in 2016, this dynamic has existed where privately Republicans will say certain things about Trump, disagree with him, criticize him, say maybe that he's not fit to serve as president. But then when the cameras are running, they say something totally different and express support and unity. This is exactly what Democrats are doing now. A lot of Democrats privately are talking about how they don't believe that Joe Biden is fit to serve another 4 years as president. They just don't think he can do it physically. Yet, when the cameras come on, they're saying, well, if he's a nominee, we're going to support him. It's a very difficult position to be in as an elected official, as a member of a political party where you think one thing privately, but you really don't want to say it publicly.
I mean, it's a little bit different because there are Republicans who say privately that Trump
is a danger to the country and to the world, that it's a danger to the party, it's a danger to voters, it's danger, has caused all these divisions. So it's a little bit different than what you're seeing. I think the challenge is, how do you interpret, as we have these discussions, the polling data, right, which show there are two different interpretations. One is polling really hasn't changed very much, that there was a view about President Biden and about President Trump that was baked in the cake before the debate. Voters don't move quite so dramatically as maybe folks watching this might expect or think or hypothesize. And even despite relentless coverage and almost a standstill of any other conversation, there hasn't really been that much movement. The flip side is, how do you look at, it's better to be up than down, right? So if you have polling before the debate that shows the president trailing by a little bit, and that hasn't changed, that's what's, I think, causing some concern, because the stakes are so high when you look at, and Democrats are very much unified in this respect, that Trump, like some Republicans privately, that Trump is a danger to the country.
Yeah. Well, as you bring up polling and bring up sort of high-stakes places, I want to pull up some polling from the high-stakes battleground state of Wisconsin. So Wisconsin, this poll shows Biden is down 5 points to Trump, but Senator Tammy Baldwin is up 5 points in the Senate race. I wonder what you make of that disconnect, or some would say, between where President Biden stands in polling versus where down-ballot candidates, in this case, Tammy Baldwin.
Well, I mean, they're evaluating the races, they're potentially evaluating races and candidates individually. And Tammy Baldwin's opponent has taken a lot of incoming. He has been uneven in how he communicates about the state that he's running for and the state where he's from, which are two different states. And so I think, people are, thinking about these races in a variety of different ways. And I think it's important for the president, which you've been seeing since the debate, for him to be out there talking to folks and campaigning and being out on the trail. And I think as you're going to see that, that will change how voters are responding to it. Certainly it's changed how some members of Congress and the press are responding to it.
But I think the polling is also part of the reason why there is so much hand-wringing among Democrats behind the scenes, because they're worried that if people who are inclined to support Joe Biden but are concerned about his mental health, his mental acuity, whatever you want to call it, they don't want to vote for Trump, and what if they stay home? Yeah. And so these are the people, the down-ballot races, the frontliners, the senators who are in battleground states or in really close contests. They're worried about a Democratic majority in Congress in addition to losing the White House. Yeah. And that's where a lot of the concerns that people are saying behind closed doors and communicating to the White House, it's not just about, can Biden win? It's about, is Biden going to pull down the rest of the Democratic ticket in November? And
I want to stick with you. There's also, of course, the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus that's sticking with the president here. I wonder, is that enough of a firewall? And when it comes to black lawmakers in particular, what do you think is fueling this?
It's such an interesting dynamic. Some of this is about loyalty. Yeah. People. And there's simultaneous conversations happening. So a lot of black lawmakers feel very loyal to President Trump and feel President Biden, loyal to President Biden, and feel that his first term he's done good things. And so they want to respect that and not come across as if they're trying to push him out. I think there's also, and then of course there's still that disagreement within the Congressional Black Caucus, perhaps not as vocal because the leaders of the Congressional Black Caucus are kind of more in line with Biden than maybe some of the rank and file are.
I want to ask you a quick question, just a follow-up before I open this up. Do you think that there's a sort of balance that Biden in particular has to strike here between relying on black people, black voters, black lawmakers, while also not feeling like he's pandering to them and feeling like, well, the black women, they're always going to show up for me, though we know that black women have all sorts of issues, and sometimes privately say, like, why do we always have to save the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's an age-old question. We can talk all show about just black voters, their allegiance to the Democratic Party, why that has remained steadfast, even as black voters express deep disappointment with the Democratic Party. I will say I went to Essence Festival with Vice President Harris this past weekend. Even black voters are divided on President Biden. You will talk to black voters who say, I support President Biden and what he did, but not all of them agree he should run for a second term.
Yeah, and Carlos, I want to bring you in. Tell me a little bit about what you think about whoever the replacement is, if President Biden was to step down, even though he's saying he's not. Is that person set up to fail, whether it's VP Harris or somebody else, 4 months before an election?
I think just about anyone would be a better candidate because they would have room to grow. President Biden does not have room to grow. Everyone knows him already. And because of this challenge that about 75% of voters don't think he's up to serving another 4 years, how does someone like that grow? How does someone like that convince these very limited number of swing voters in swing states that they should vote for him instead? Meanwhile, Trump is on offense with the political center. He's kind of disavowing national restrictions for abortion, a big deal in the Republican Party. He's disavowing some of these more radical groups. Why? Because he thinks that now he can kind of move away from his base to try to make himself more desirable to some of these middle-of-the-road voters.
But he can't. He's on the. I mean, he was filmed on tape here at MSNBC at this network saying there's got to be some sort of punishment for women. I mean, he cannot run away from those positions. He boasts about being able to kill Roe v. Wade. It doesn't matter what he says. Right now, he can't even get press. He's like desperate to try and get press, but there's no way that he can run away from those comments.
Yeah, well, we could talk about this for a lot longer, but we have to go here. Thank you so much to Tia, to Margie, to Carlos.
Thank you.
And we want to take a moment to remember Senator Jim Inhofe, who died early this morning after suffering a stroke over the weekend. He was 89 years old. Inhofe was the longest-serving senator in Oklahoma history. He was elected in 1994 and retired just last year. A staunch conservative and a vocal critic of environmental regulations, he proudly rejected the science of climate change. He also famously brought a snowball into the Senate chambers, claiming it was proof the planet was not warming. A longtime pilot, Inhofe sponsored the Pilots' Bill of Rights in 2012. Here he is on Meet the Press in 2013 talking about how flying helped him win a seat in the Senate.
For Senator Jim Inhofe, politics is his life, but flying is his passion. He got his pilot license as a young man, and around Oklahoma, he is known to fly himself to campaign events. That skill, he says, got him into the U.S. Senate.
Back in 1994, I was running a race. I was 32 points behind, but I was everywhere. I mean, I'd get in one of my planes, and I could be from the Panhandle down to southeastern Oklahoma in a matter of 2 hours, and it takes somebody out. It took my opponent about 7 hours to do the same thing.
Welcome back. In just a few minutes, President Biden is set to deliver remarks at NATO's 75th anniversary celebration. It kicks off a high-stakes meetings as the president looks to reassure Democrats and now world leaders that he's up for the job. NATO is expected to announce a series of measures aimed at shoring up Ukraine's long-term support. It's being viewed as an effort to Trump-proof the alliance should he win in November. It comes after yesterday, a massive Russian missile attack struck Ukraine's largest children's hospital, reducing parts of the complex to rubble. President Zelensky said 38 people were killed in the attack, including 4 children, and 190 others were injured. Joining me now is Richard Haass, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for being here, Richard.
Thanks, Yamiche.
Now, we've talked about concerns about President Biden's age when it comes to the election, but how closely, I wonder, will world leaders also be watching President Biden's performance this week? And I wonder, what do you think they're looking for?
Well, there's 2 things. One is the entire summit takes place against the specter, shall we say, of Donald Trump. So you asked whether NATO can somehow Trump-proof itself vis-a-vis Ukraine or any other issue, and the answer is no, it cannot. Presidents of the United States have enormous discretion when it comes to foreign policy. So that, shall we say, is a sobering or distracting thought for most of the other 31 leaders. In case of President Biden, there were lots of concerns after his recent 2 visits to Europe for the Normandy events and then for the G7. So they're going to look at everything he says, how he walks, how he talks, and they're curious. They just want to see how he's doing because, again, they've seen the debate. They're seeing the debate about the debate, and they're obviously wondering who's going to lead this country come January.
Yeah. And it's interesting as you say, world leaders are wondering who's going to lead the country. I mean, those questions were there during the first NATO summit that President Biden attended, where he attended as president, I should say. He told world leaders then that America is back, but there were questions even back then about how long America would be back. I wonder if those concerns you think are even more pronounced today, given all of this talk about President Biden's age and whether or not he can really run and be the candidate here.
Absolutely. And that's a real departure. I mean, it's important to think back. It wasn't that long ago that whoever was elected president, Democrat or Republican, it didn't matter a whole lot when it came to NATO, when it came to U.S.-European relations. There was a strong presumption based on reality of continuity. And what Donald Trump has done is introduced anything but. Now there's all sorts of uncertainty. So when President Biden said 4 years ago America was back, quite honestly, no, it was back for 4 years for the most part. And as you saw, when he couldn't deliver the aid on Ukraine for quite a few months, even with a Democratic president who's pro-Europe, he couldn't always deliver the United States. But there's no way he or any president now can claim continuity, given that the Republicans, when it comes to foreign policy, particularly Donald Trump, are so outside what you might call the post-World War II mainstream.
Yeah, it's really striking to think about just sort of whiplash that some foreign leaders and foreign officials feel with American elections. I wonder, when you think about this moment and the conversations you're having with foreign officials, do they view President Biden as a lame duck, even though he has more than 6 months left in his first term?
I think something of that. They see the polls. Look, they're all politicians. They've all been elected. They know that a week's a long time in politics. 4 months is a long time and then some. But yes, I think they see him certainly as weakened. I don't think they've given up on the possibility he could be the next president. But they're not even sure he's going to be the Democratic nominee, much less he'll win if he is. Again, what this has introduced is layer upon layer of uncertainty. And that's a problem because alliances are, at the end of the day, are based upon certainty. The United States has pledged to come to the defense of other countries in NATO if they're attacked. Well, suddenly, if Donald Trump's elected, that's all very much in doubt. Aid to Ukraine is in doubt. And that's what essentially it corrodes or erodes the fabric of an alliance.
Yeah, and we talked about at the beginning of this about Trump-proofing NATO. What do you make of that? What can leaders in this situation do to sort of make commitments that are binding and not just sort of go out the window if Trump is elected?
They can for the alliance, but the Europeans can do an awful lot. And I think that's in some ways the most interesting place to watch about whether the Europeans are prepared to spend more, to spend more collectively so they get more bang for their bucks or their euros, whether they're prepared to make long-term commitments to Ukraine, whether they'll expand their ability to produce arms and ammunition. And that's important regardless of who's the next president, because the United States is going to be more focused on Asia, more focused on the Middle East than is Europe. So to me, the most interesting thing is not what NATO commits to, it's what the European members of NATO commit to.
Yeah, and of course, as you talk about our European allies, the U.S. isn't the only NATO country facing political upheaval. There's, of course, a new prime minister in the U.K. There's the politics that happened in France. Even though a far-right group far-right party didn't take power there, what do you think about these recent events abroad and how they sort of connect with what's going on here at home?
Look, it's a really good point. The political message is it's a bad year to be an incumbent. The foreign policy message is that the post-World War II, even post-Cold War consensus is breaking down. In France, the good news is the far right didn't win, but then you have the bad news of the far left. Britain's continuity, but Germany, again, the strength of this government, the strength of the center is suspect. Italy has a much more right-wing government than it used to. What, again, it tells me, Amish, is we can't take for granted that the sorts of policies that have been in place now for 75 years are going to be in place for another 5 years, much less another 75.
Yeah, well, definitely an alliance to watch and certainly a moment in history to continue to follow. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you.
I want to turn now to the security situation in Haiti. It's been 2 weeks since the Kenyan-led multinational force began their security mission there. They're hoping to tackle rampant gang violence that has wreaked havoc on the country. Gangs are estimated to control 80% of Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince. And they've killed several thousands of people in recent years. And yesterday, in his first public comments, the head of the Kenyan security force there said, quote, "There is no room for failure." Joining me now is my friend and colleague, Jacqueline Charles, the Caribbean correspondent at the Miami Herald. Jackie, thank you so much to be here. You, of course, know Haiti better than any other reporter. So this Kenyan force has been deployed to Haiti for a few weeks now. Have they really been able to accomplish much so far? And what's the biggest challenges that lie ahead?
Well, first of all, there are only 200 on the ground. They're not 400, as some people have been reporting. They're still getting acclimated. They've been out. They've done some patrols with the Haitian National Police. So we have been trying to find out more in terms of how involved are they going to be in operations to dismantle gangs. We are not getting any answers, whether you ask U.S. officials, which are the largest funders and the backers of this force, or the Kenyans themselves. They're basically saying because of strategic purposes or security, we're not going to go into those details. But there's a lot of hope on the part of the Haitian population that they will be able to dismantle these gangs, and that Port-au-Prince will return to some sense of normalcy, whatever that means these days.
Yeah, definitely a lot of hope here. But since the assassination of President Jovenel Moise on July 7, 2021, an estimated 80% of Haiti's capital is controlled by gangs. I mean, you can't underscore enough the sort of chaos that's happening right now. Do these Kenyan forces, 200 of them, as you report, do they really have the capabilities needed to wrestle back power from these gangs?
Well, that's what we have to see. I mean, they got some armored vehicles. They're armed, better armed than the Haitian National Police. They are the first 200 of 1,000 Kenyans who are expected to be in Haiti at some point. The entire multinational security support mission is supposed to be about 2,500. It's still unclear how many foreign troops are going to be on the ground. But I have to tell you, the Haitian police have done an admirable job in holding on to this capital. The gangs have attacked government ministries. They have forced now almost 600,000 people from their homes over the last 3 years. But the problem that they have is that when they go into an area and they take back control, because of their numbers, because of the pressure, they can't hold on to it. And that's really what they're hoping, that the Kenyans can help them to take control and hold control while they continue to do some of these operations.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, the Haitian forces have been doing an admirable job here, and Haiti has they requested this international force to combat the gangs in 2022. But the Kenyan forces also have been accused by watchdogs and witnesses of human rights abuses, including allegations that they shot unarmed civilians. We both know that Haiti has a long history in international forces wreaking havoc at times on the people. I wonder what the process for accountability, should there be human rights violations in Haiti, and how concerned are people on the ground about bringing out outside forces here?
Well, so you asked two very important questions. First of all, there are several agreements that have been signed going into this process in terms of rules of engagement and also in terms of the oversight. The UN will have oversight, even though this is not a United Nations backed force. But there is a process in place in case there are any allegations, not just against the Kenyans, but the Jamaicans or any member of these foreign forces that are there in Haiti. And in terms of how Haitians feel, I mean, this has been a process. In the beginning of the debate that Haitians were having was, do we really want to have another foreign intervention? And people are looking at the history from the U.S. 1915 to the most recent, just 7 years ago. But as the security situation has become increasingly untenable, when you're talking about 5 million people who are hungry, when you're talking about 1 million plus people with famine, people are saying, just give me help, just get it from anywhere, I don't care.
Yeah. Well, Jackie Charles of the Miami Herald, a dear friend, and again, the best reporter on Haiti in the world, I would say. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And some breaking news just in. Democratic Congressman of New Jersey, Margie Sherrill, is now calling on President Biden to withdraw from the presidential race. She becomes the 7th Democrat to publicly call on Biden not to run for re-election, in addition to 2 other lawmakers who are privately calling for him to step aside. Much more on that next. Welcome back. As we mentioned, Congresswoman Margie Sherrill just called on President Biden to drop out of the presidential race. Joining me now from Capitol Hill is NBC News correspondent Ali Vitale. So, Ali, what can you tell us about what's going on here?
Look, this comes after a morning where it seemed like Democrats were at least going to be in a static waiting point, asking the president to show them that he can be the kind of standard bearer that will give them confidence after that debate a week and a half ago. Now, of course, we're seeing Congresswoman Margie Sherrill come forward and say that she wants President Biden to step down as the nominee of the party. I'll read to you a part of her statement that just came out in the last few minutes. She says, "I know President Biden and his team have been true public servants and put the country in best interests of democracy first. And because I know President Biden cares deeply about the future of our country, I'm asking that he declare that he won't run for re-election and will help lead us through a process towards a new nominee." Of course, Sherrill becomes the 7th Democrat to publicly call for President Biden to resign his post as the Democratic nominee. She's the 9th overall because, of course, we've had some reporting that takes us inside private phone calls and other conversations that Democrats have had with their colleagues, but certainly not the trend line that you want to see if you're the Biden campaign and the Biden administration, trying to just stop the bleeding and trying to make it that Democrats stay in wait-and-see mode, allow him to prove himself as the nominee, instead of coming forward and saying after a week and a half they'd like him to step down.
Yeah, do you get a sense that maybe the dam is breaking here? I mean, at first it thought that it was looking like maybe President Biden had weathered the worst of the storm here.
It really is too soon to say, and I've asked lawmakers this, including one fellow frontliner, Congressman Greg Landsman of Ohio. I said, do you think that after this morning, this tough family conversation that y'all had behind closed doors, that it's finally over? He said, I don't know, but he does notice that in the voters he's talking to and in the voters that other of his colleagues are talking to, he says that there is a real palpable concern about Trump being reelected, and that's why they're demanding so much of President Biden. That's why there's this skittishness and, again, reminding of the stakes here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ali Vitale, for rushing to the camera with this breaking news as another lawmaker comes out to say for President Biden to step down. So we'll be back tomorrow, but thank you so much, Ali. And we'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues right now with Ali Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.